Thank you. Only yesterday, I finally completed Paul Kelly's daunting tome, The End of Certainty, after sporadic attempts at getting through this illuminating account of a seminal period in our country's history, the 1980s. At times compelling in its insights and fascinating in its intrigues, and at times feeling under distinct threat of being chloroformed by arcane economic detail, I found Kelly's account of the history and politics of Australia from 1983 to the present indispensable to understanding the economic and social policy revolution which the Hawke-Keating Labor government led through this period. Kelly's broad analysis is of three phases of Australia's history following the coming of Europeans. Firstly, the foundation period from the time of European occupation to the late 19th century, then the long reign of what he calls the Australian settlement, from Federation to the end of Fraser, and then the deconstruction of the Australian settlement from the Hawke-Keating era to the present. The pillars of the Australian settlement, to which Kelly shows there was a basic bipartisan national commitment for over 80 years, were the pillars of white Australia, trade protection, wage arbitration, state paternalism, and imperial benevolence. These pillars eventually came to be understood to be unviable policy principles, which ill-served a country that was going to have any hope of being economically, culturally, and socially strong now that the farm and the quarry were no longer providing for the lifestyles to which the country had long become accustomed. The Labor government's policy revolution of the 1980s was fundamental to the deconstruction of that Australian settlement. The fundamental nature of the reforms, contemporaneously derided as that scourge economic rationalism, but now the accepted orthodoxy, can scarcely be comprehended for the scale of the challenge which the country's structural problems represented for Australians in 1983. So many of the accepted ways of life and business in Australia had to be disturbed, and reform and the courage for reform was imperative. But even as the country has striven to get the fundamental economic reforms into place, there's always been the question of what social and cultural policy would best serve a nation which is committed to a free market and committed to a future in Asia. Today I focus on one particular policy challenge which is key to achieving fundamental reform in the social life of the nation, the challenge of a lasting and just reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. And I wish to locate the position of Aboriginal people in the national scheme within the broader context of the economic and social policy reforms which the nation started prosecuting in the 1980s and which continues with renewed vigour in the 90s. There is no doubt in my mind that reconciliation is key to this country's achievement of a prosperous, confident, united and yet diverse national community in the new millennium. For black and white Australians to deal with the past, to acknowledge its truths and to understand its legacy and to never forget its lessons and to nevertheless engage for the future is a fundamental social accompaniment to successful economic policy. The struggle of Mabo and the long tradition of struggle of which he and his people were a part from before and including the Tent Embassy yielded to this nation an opportunity to finally put paid to the racism which has bedevilled the Aboriginal place in the national scheme, which had rendered the Indigenous people homo nullius, a people devoid of legal rights to their land and frequently to their very existence. Mabo has given us the opportunity to finally bury the legacy of the White Australia policy. The High Court has declared that the common law of our country will no longer suffer racial discrimination when it comes to determining entitlement to land. We now have national legislation which enshrines these legal rights and which aims to produce substantive justice to groups who can claim remnant rights. Furthermore, through the Indigenous Land Fund, there is now the prospect of recovering land where people are unable to establish rights at common law. For me, there are three developments which give me some optimism that we can reach the stage of confronting what we must not kid ourselves as being in large part a violent and ugly past, and to deal with its legacy in the present and still look to the future. These are The revolution in the country's historiography, which has come about because the story of the other side of the frontier has now been exposed by the oral histories of Aboriginal people and historians such as Professor Henry Reynolds. This new history, which tells of things which were long suppressed by what the late Professor Bill Stanner called in the 1960s a cult of forgetfulness, is critical for the country because it tells the truth and incorporates Aboriginal death, sacrifice and achievement in the national narrative. The second development was, of course, Mabo, which finally abandoned terra nullius as an assumed pillar of the country's legal foundation and the fundamental lessons from the High Court about the moral prescriptions of our history. The third development was Redfern Park in 1992, because here was the nation's leadership admitting the sins of the past, not wallowing in guilt, but instead expressing a preparedness to embed the legal and moral imperatives of Mabo into our national institutions and be the impetus for change for the better. These developments give hope and they provide direction. The task now is to make these symbolic and institutional achievements actually deliver social justice for people on the streets, under the tin humpies, and living under the bridges. Mabo, reconciliation, social justice, all of these things must actually have consequence for people on the ground. It must mean something for the quality and indeed the duration of their lives. And this is why the state of Aboriginal health is fundamental. It will mark success or failure. You don't need me to add to the countless reports on the subject to say that we begin way behind the 8 ball. The marginal position of the Indigenous peoples of Australia within the life of the nation is most starkly captured by one statistic: the average life expectancy of Aboriginal people compared with that of the rest of the nation. Aboriginal people of average die 20 years earlier than other Australians. I'm a self-confessed policy optimist. I'm in the talk up the possibilities business. I personally believe that community leadership is about knowing the problems, appreciating the difficulties, deconstructing the old approaches, condemning the inertia and the apathy. And community leadership is also about never giving up on the search for solutions and enjoining people to the belief that with commitment we can succeed. But when faced with such egregious statistics, one would be foolhardy to think that with optimism alone we can succeed. There are few places on earth outside of war zones where people have less chance of living to their fullest human potential. The statistics and the rate at which the situation has deteriorated since Aboriginal people have congregated into sedentary communities presents no small challenge to the country. The solutions will not be easy to locate, and they will not yield outcomes in all areas all at once. There are some problems which, if attacked with vigour and intelligence, can be eliminated quickly. Witness Fred Hollow's work with trachoma. But it is important for all of us to understand that improvement in the life expectancy of Indigenous peoples in this country is a multifaceted undertaking that goes beyond providing for primary health care to address diseases of the body. We will not see better statistics for another generation. Only when we have a society which can nurture their children from the cradle to the grave in the same way that other societies across the planet are able to do, will we see those children living into their 70s, 80s, 90s, and indeed their hundreds. It is important to not assume that somehow Aboriginal people are innately susceptible to short lives. The generation that lived and worked in the bush, on the cattle properties and in agriculture, lived well into their 80s and 90s. In my childhood and adolescence, my community was populated with large numbers of old people, including 2 grandmothers in their early 100s. These were people born in the bush and they worked hard in the bush. Today, when you go to my community, there are fewer and fewer people beyond their 50s and 60s. In their traditional lifestyle, people lived long lives. Up my way, when they worked in the cattle, they lived long lives. The trouble started when we had to leave the land and congregated together, and so many lives lost purpose and there was nothing to do. And in order to understand the deep problem with Aboriginal health, we cannot fail to acknowledge the spiritual malaise which infects the core of hundreds and thousands of Aboriginal communities and families. It is true that we have survived, but this survival has not been without cost, and there is much to repair and to heal. Policy prescriptions cannot fail to understand the wounding of Aboriginal identity and the sheer psychological toll which the settlement pillar of white Australia has had on a people for most of Australia's colonial history. The discomfort and terror of Aboriginal people so conditioned to racism and, at best, indifference from white society actually translates into these people being afraid to visit hospitals and doctors' surgeries. I remember as a young child watching the dignity of those dearest to me, strong, beautiful people in their own right, quivering whenever they dealt with white society and particularly officialdom. Until Aboriginal people feel proud and comfortable in their own country and comfortable in their dealings with other Australians, the spiritual malaise will represent the biggest reason for our failure to make progress on Aboriginal health. That is why the issues of land ownership, meaningful work opportunities, economic development, cultural renaissance and social justice are an inescapable part of the solution. Leadership from government and from the leadership of the Aboriginal community is key. Our people who daily suffer the problems cannot afford cynicism. Not from the media, not from the government, not from the opposition, and not from their own leadership. Action on improving Aboriginal health must begin now, and we will posture on the graves of our people as long as we dwell on the problems and fail to grapple with the solutions. There has been some commentary in recent weeks about whether the lack of bipartisanship from advocates such as myself about the direction of national policy is to be desired. Let me give you the reasons why I believe that within the context of the major social and cultural reforms which the country is engaged with in the 1990s, that the basic directions of Aboriginal policy which have emerged in recent years are correct. Firstly, it is because the new direction is based on right and not charity. Secondly, there has to be an emphasis on pragmatic results as well as a focus on our ideals. Our decisions on health have to be action-oriented. Thirdly, we have to deal with the moral turbulence which our colonial past brings to bear on the present. There can no longer be denial. Fourthly, there is no place for victims. Aboriginal people desire justice, equality, and there is a need to find strength through empowerment. The tragic and pervasive concept of the victim, which many Indigenous leaders have and still do mistakenly perpetuate, is ultimately a paternalistic and disempowering one. I say that we have the intelligence, resourcefulness, and grace to find the strength to succeed. Finally, there is no place for bleeding hearts, only for open and honest ones. Bleeding hearts always see victims. Confronted by Aboriginal poverty and disease, they inevitably ask, what can we do to help them? Rather than again smoothing the dying pillow, I say that the question to ask is, what can we do to make the conditions such that Aboriginal people can help themselves and need no longer be perpetual victims? Governments and a committed Australian community can indeed make the changes and take the effort to produce the conditions whereby Aboriginal people can look after and nurture their own. The changes centre on resources, economic development, land, and so on. Let me say that this club has an important responsibility to engage in this problem, not just to illuminate the problems, but to grapple with the solutions, to locate the state of Aboriginal health within the broader picture of the kind of society we want in the antipodes in the future. It behoves those of us whose job is to analyse the problems and challenges which face Australia to be cynical about prospects for improvement and indeed success. Critique must be followed by reconstruction, and we have to realise that this challenge is one for the long term. In conclusion, my belief is that the new directions of Aboriginal policy which have emerged in the 90s are the correct ones. I believe that the Australian community wants to see success and is prepared to give this, as in all things, a fair go. We need to be mindful of history when we resort to the cheap observation that Aboriginal policy is just too hard and is receiving inordinate public attention, the too much Mabo of recent parlance. When the national land rights model was abandoned, the popular interpretation of this backdown, put forward by the then Prime Minister Hawke, was that public sentiment was not in favour of reform. Many commentators have since questioned this white backlash theory, popularised and blindly accepted at the time. What the polls did show then, and increasingly show today, is that there is a groundswell across the nation in support of progress. The reason that I even give a damn is my belief that ultimately empathy and humanity will shine through if there is determination and courage in our community leadership. The difference between Hawke and national land rights and Keating and native title is that there is now a preparedness to educate and to defend and to lead, and not simply follow and compound fears and ignorance. It's my view that decency in Aboriginal policy has now become, in Australian political discourse, a marker of credibility and a commitment to social cohesion, because there's no other choice other than cohesion. The futures of black and white Australians are inescapably enmeshed, no matter what fantasies some of us might harbour. This is not to say assimilation, but something more intelligent and necessary: unity through diversity. Black and white Australians cannot afford cynicism because our future will be a shared one. The challenge for the conservative side of politics, anxious for bipartisanship, is to understand that racism has been the most virulent disease contributing to the malaise within Indigenous Australia. The settlement pillar of white Australia cannot now be exhumed from its new grave. Justice, rights, and responsibility must be the future national policy direction, not least in the area of Aboriginal health. The challenge for the Conservatives is not to undo the achievements and to abandon the direction. I think that through the efforts on the social justice package that we have to look at the situation of those who have been most dispossessed through colonial history and realise that it's not just a matter of bringing people up to a position of equality, but recognising that these people also need justice. There has got to be a reparation made with these people in relation to basic rights to land and so on. So I would see that the delivery of basic services is essential, but you can't put aside the question of rights. I think the question of the move from ATSIC to the Department of Health is one of finally giving Aboriginal medical organisations and Aboriginal communities access to the $34 billion spent on the health of all Australians. For the first time, our medical services will have to bring to account the expenditure of the Federal Health Department on Aboriginal health. And I think that's one of the advantages of a shift over to the Department of Health. From now on, ATSIC cannot be blamed for having insufficient resources to address a massive problem. In the future, I would expect the buck stops with the Minister for Health and Federal Cabinet to make sure that Indigenous Australians are getting their fair share. They're getting their fair share of the $34 billion which is spent on health nationally. I think the biggest obstacle to getting progress on Aboriginal health is that most of the resources are being channeled through the states, and the behaviour of the states in history has not contributed to a solution to Aboriginal living conditions. I think that the new direction must carefully assess whether the states are finally willing to get into a cooperative venture with the Commonwealth along the lines of that were reached yesterday in relation to competition policy. If there was just a smidgen of cooperation between the states and the Commonwealth on Aboriginal health, we would see vast improvement. We've never had that goodwill, we've never had that cooperation, and there's just been stonewalling and intransigence. So I see that tackling the states has got to be a major part of the Commonwealth Commonwealth's health agenda upon assuming responsibility. It's not just the challenge I have, it's a challenge we have. And I see that education of the Australian community has got to face the fact that there are special measures required to bring Aboriginal people up to a position of equity. We're talking about a people who are living 20 years less life than anybody else across the continent. Now, if that doesn't bring to the front of our skulls the proposition that some special measures need to be introduced to get the improvements and advancement in place, well then I'm not sure what kind of statistic will get us around to that position. I think there's an acceptance right across the Australian community that the Aboriginal condition is particularly deplorable. And the thing about the small percentage of the Aboriginal population is that a solution to this problem is within our grasp and within our means. We can never forget that a solution to these problems is within our means. We're a prosperous nation. We're a nation that is committed to a fair go. And I think the stumbling block has been the ideas and the bringing these issues to the front of the public mind, and I think pragmatically crashing through with the solutions. There's not enough hard-headed thought been given to how it is that we can get action happening in Aboriginal health. And my hope is that the new direction will be a cooperative one between strong, committed national government and strong, committed Aboriginal leadership on the ground. It's that kind of formula that I think is going to achieve the changes that are needed. In relation to the states, I, like the Democrats, have harboured this fantasy that the states might disappear, but I think, but I think that there has to be an acceptance that they're part of the problem with which we have to deal. And I'm optimistic that in Queensland, for instance, that with a strong Aboriginal medical service leadership and assistance from the Commonwealth Government, that we can actually get some good out of the State Department of Health. That's where the expertise is, that's where a lot of the dollars are, and I think that adopting a pragmatic approach to getting some of these solutions in place require us to engage with recalcitrant state governments and bring them to account. And I think that the Commonwealth has an important role, as I say, an important role to play in terms of the conditions that they attach to funding to the states to bring them to account. Well, that obviously, I mean, it's not very hard to glean that I share some grave reservations about how the opposition might tackle some of these questions when in government. I have grave reservations about how they would treat this fundamental question of Mabo. And so I think that I think it's an illustration of the problem of state rights when you realise that state rights has been traditionally the umbrella under which a policy of failure to help the Aboriginal community has been justified. That's the umbrella that has justified inaction on Aboriginal improvement. But the states surely don't have a right to deny these basic human rights to Indigenous people.